evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders as they had been during past invasion scares. The waterfront in Havana and along other parts of the coast bristled with gun emplacements as the Cuban regime waited to see what their bosses in the Kremlin were to do. Cuba became the focus of world attention. Here centered the most critical threat of global war since the surrender of Germany 17 years ago. To suggestions that a UN team inspect missile sites, Castro said that they had better come ready for combat. He went on to call President Kennedy a pirate for setting up the quarantine. The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet. Literally thousands of pictures can be made on each flight by these planes, and they are studied by photo interpreters who are capable of analyzing details that an untrained eye would miss. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets. Another photo revealed a surface-to-air missile assembly depot, a base to supply the offensive sites. Russian technicians ripped through heavy jungle growth to carve out airstrips for high-performance MiG-21 jets, a plane easily capable of strikes far into the United States. The United States went to the UN Security Council for a resolution calling for a withdrawal of all offensive weapons from Cuba. The curtain goes up at the United Nations on what the world hopes is the final act in the drama that was the Cuban crisis. The Soviet Union is represented by Khrushchev's special envoy, Russia's first deputy foreign minister, Vasily Kuznetsov. He is here to confer with Utante before the acting Secretary General left for Cuba to arrange the dismantling of Soviet missile bases. Utante met separately with both Russian and United States representatives to iron out some preliminary details before his conferences with Castro. It is planned that observers from nations not allied with either side will supervise the removal of the sites. Then it is hoped the final curtain will fall. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara presides at an unprecedented news conference to refute charges that the administration is holding back on the strength of Russian men and arms in Cuba. The charges were made by members of Congress, and Mr. McNamara is emphatic in denying that there has been an appreciable buildup. He turns the briefing over to John Hughes, a Pentagon intelligence aide, who reveals for the first time that Russia had nuclear weapons in Cuba until the October retreat to Moscow. He went on to add that Soviet military personnel in Cuba reached a peak of 22,000 by November 1st, but this has been reduced to about 17,000. Senator Kenneth Keating of New York, who has charged repeatedly that the administration has underestimated Soviet strength in Cuba, is not satisfied with the exposition.
I stand on my statement that there's 10 times as much military equipment there now, and in addition to this, the Soviet troops are digging in. These combat troops are building semi-permanent or permanent barracks, and this is a part of my statement that they're at least 10 times stronger.
The next day, at the President's news conference, little attention is paid to any matter but the Cuban question.
This issue involves a very definitely war and peace, and when you talk about the presence of offensive weapons there, if they are there, I think the Soviet Union is aware, and Cuba is aware, that we would be back where we were in October, but in a far more concentrated way. And after our experience last fall, we operate on the assumption while hoping for the best, we expect the worst. It's very possible that the worst will come, and we should prepare for it. That's why we continue our daily surveillance. It's possible, conceivable. We cannot prove that there is not a missile in a cave, or the Soviet Union isn't going to ship next week. We prepare for that. But we will find them when they do, and when they do, the Soviet Union and Cuba and the United States must all be aware that this will produce the greatest crisis which the world has faced in its history.